Now, if you thought the speakers had a tough task of 7 minutes, our respondents, Mamadou and Martha, are tasked with 5 minutes to speak and comment directly on what has been said.
Okay, 5 minutes. And this panel. So I just want to say a few things. First, that I'm both honored and really intimidated to be commenting on this panel of speakers, all of whom made an appearance in my recent MA thesis. So that's a bit intimidating. And I just want to say, too, that while the papers are diverse in terms of their scope and their scale and their topics, there were a number of ideas and questions and concepts and tensions that are raised that kind of stream through all of the papers. So the way that I was going to attack this is to go just paper by paper, just a couple of things that I noticed, and we'll see how quickly I can get through it. And I have 2 points to make at the end, so I'll skip ahead if I run out of time. So just on the paper that we heard from Jack Kloppenberg on the open source seeds. I think that he's right to identify seeds as a key space or vector for the manifestation of food sovereignty. And I think that the paper grapples with interesting tensions, especially in terms of how and to what extent we can repurpose the tools of the master and whether that's actually practical. One of the areas that I thought was a little difficult was this contention that the examination of GMOs are identified as dangerous by food sovereignty advocates, mainly because of corporate control and all that entails. And I think obviously that's a key piece, but it's not the only factor. And so I think the idea that open source licensing of seeds may open the box for open source genetically modified organisms might be a contentious piece that isn't very well examined in the paper. In terms of Henry Bernstein's, there are many things I would like to obviously discuss here, but one of the key things for me is that I think there's an interesting critique in this paper about the binary that food sovereignty is posited as capital's other. And that this binary sets up the idea that capitalism can only be viewed in its destructive nature and not in its creative, the dialectic of creative and destructive sides of capitalism. And I think that this is actually, to me, from the Via Campesina's point of view, this is an obvious political tool. So creating that binary has, it makes sense from the political point of view. It's the purpose of how we frame what we're working against and how we frame what we're working for. But I think it does open up the possibility of viewing food sovereignty as advocating for a pre-capitalist society, which is not the intent of food sovereignty. And I think that that's not how the movement views food sovereignty at all. And instead, we view it as building a new movement. So it's not a regression. It's something different. That has elements maybe from the past, but also has new and creative thinking. So I think that conversation is an interesting one to have that Henry opens up. And I think also that he raises an interesting point and an important question of not only if peasants or petty commodity producers, as he terms them, can feed the global population, but also how. And I think that how question is a question that obviously we're working on. And I think some of the examples that Harriet had been working on, and also the nested markets that Jan Douwe has been working on, are examples of trying to grapple with, well, how are we going to feed the urban populations? But I also think that it's still a valid question. Oh my goodness. Okay. Skipping ahead. I think that Jan Douwe's paper really answers in a lot of ways and is in dialogue in a lot of ways with Henry's paper, and brings up a lot of the classic debates around how do you measure productivity and the definition of peasant and all of these kinds of questions. I would like to see, I know that you've written a lot on nested markets, and I'd like to see a little bit more on how nested markets are differentiated in your mind from so-called traditional markets that have existed, for an indefinite period of time, and how do we see whether that's is there a creative thing that's happening here, or is that just a reiteration of something old? I'm curious about that. I'm not going to comment so much on Harriet and Raj's because the papers that I read were not specifically what you talked about here. But I just want to come back to two themes in my closing minute here. One is that it seems to me that there's a big question of definition, and that comes up over and over and over again in many of the papers. And I think that it's a key problem, obviously. But from my point of view, it's less important that we resolve what I feel is an unresolvable debate between whether or not peasants exist, because I think there are two very different perspectives on this, and I don't think that we're going to convince the other of our point of view. I think it's more important actually to recognize that peasants are busy defining themselves, and that in the Vietcong scene we've been actively reclaiming the term. So perhaps the definition of peasants is changing, and it can't be based in the old debate, or perhaps it isn't changing. Perhaps it is in the old debate, but maybe it's a question of degrees and whether it's possible. Whether it's possible or not to be, or how we can be embedded in capitalist relations and still maintain a peasant character, which leads me to my very last point, which is just that I think this is a point actually that Mamadou already made in some extent, so I won't take any time because I have to end. But just to say that I think that it's really important that we think about the way we're defining things, but that we also that we are conscious of the idea that we don't try to over-define to the point where we're losing the diversity and specificity that food sovereignty offers us. And maybe I'll leave it there. I have about 10 other things to say, but thanks.